Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is David Zyla. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following this conversation, there will be a brief Q&A, so feel free to use the chat or Q&A function to ask any questions that you might have. So I am very excited to introduce to you today Amy De La Haye, and let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a curator and writer. She's a professor of dress history and curatorship and joint director of the Research Center for Fashion Curation at London College of Fashion. She has curated fashion exhibitions within international spaces and published extensively on fashion, fashion archives, museology, collecting, and curatorial practices. She has also written the Clara Button children's books for the Victoria and Albert Museum. She is currently working on an exhibition with Colleen Hill at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology called Ravishing, the Rose in Fashion, which will open in 2021. Formerly, she was curator of 20th century dress at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Amy, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for choosing my book for your event. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm going to start by giving a talk about the book, and then I'd like to take questions at the end. It's got lots of images because it's such a wonderfully visual subject. The project is an exhibition which is going to open at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. It was delayed because of COVID, so it's going to open, we hope, in the spring. But the exciting thing is that the galleries are all ready. All the props are installed, and it's just waiting for the clothes to be put into the gallery. The book was published to coincide with the exhibition, but because of COVID, the book got published just as lockdown happened and managed to get published in time. And as a result, the book's published before the exhibitions opened. So today it's my pleasure to talk to you a little bit about the making of the book. I regard writing as a practice, and when I write a book, I really do feel that I make something. It feels like an object. The book's been published by Yale University Press, where I've worked with Mark Eastman, who was my publisher at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we've got a long-term working relationship. And I'm actually really pleased because he's here this evening. And he's responsible for arts and architecture at Yale in London, and also working with Anjali Bully, who's the most amazing editor. The book is a book that orbits around an exhibition, and so it orbits around objects. It looks at how the rose has impacted upon the way we dress, look, feel, fantasize, from the 18th century to the latest gender-neutral catwalk collections today. It draws extensively on the incredible collections at the Museum of the Fashion Institute of Technology, which is inspirationally directed by Dr. Valerie Steele, who I was over the moon accepted my idea for an exhibition and to work with, as you said earlier, fashion curator Colleen Hill from FIT. I'm just going to put my PowerPoint on. And this is the cover of the book. The book's been designed by Charlie Smith, who's the most amazing graphic designer. And the image is a catwalk design by a designer called Nwakai Ninamaya. He is part of the Comme des Garçons stable of designers, and he designs the most extraordinary clothes. They're extraordinary in the way that they're constructed, but they have the look and the feel of roses. And the mannequins often have fresh roses in their hair. And whereas a lot of 19th century sort of rose symbolism and rose personification was often quite sort of sweetly romantic, I love his work because it's like rose personification at its most militant. The book starts and ends with two quotes. This is the quote that it starts with. Fashion is a little like radium, or like essence of roses, which, if undiluted, was asphyxiate. It's a statement by Charles James, who's probably my favourite couturier. I found it amongst various papers at the archive at the V&A, and I'd kept the paper for years and was over the moon when I found this quote. So why roses and fashion? What are the links? Let's start by maybe thinking about some of the parallels. Well, roses and fashion are both a luxury and they're both ephemeral. They're both shown on catwalks, at flower shows, and more recently on the internet. Their appeal is multisensorial. They're both collected. They both incite passion and obsession, and there's even a rose called Obsession. And not surprisingly, the savage thorns, although technically they're actually prickles that protect the flower, have long inspired designers, writers, artists who've variously drawn allusions to love, beauty, sexuality, sin, rites of passage, gendered identities, degradation, and death. So there's masses of stories that we can draw upon when we're looking at roses. The rose as a flower dates back some 35 to 40 million years ago. It's been cultivated for thousands of years. It grows across most of the world, so various cultures have their own associations with roses. On the left is a photograph of a double hybrid tea rose, and over the years, many cultivated roses have been named after people, including fashion designers, and this really beautiful red rose was named after the Parisian haute couturier Christian Dior. Dior was most commonly associated with lily of the valley, which was his signature flower. But he adored flowers. He grew flowers in his youth. Lots of his clothes and hats are decorated with roses, and the museum at FIT have got some absolutely beautiful examples. And following his premature death in 1957, the rose breeder Myland named this beautiful red rose Christian Dior. And on the right is a catwalk photograph of Alexander McQueen's collection showing the most extraordinary bolero, which is based upon the form of a rose. And in the book, I've crowned Alexander McQueen as fashion's rosarian. I think more than any other designer, he's been inspired by the look and the feel of roses, and the construction of some of his garments were just extraordinary. And they've been continued by Sarah Burton, who's the designer now. This extraordinary bolero came from a collection from fall 2008 called Girl Who Lived in a Tree. Here are some more parallels. On the left is a Dutch vanitas painting from the 17th century, and vanitas paintings contained items that symbolize the transience of life and the vanity of earthly goods and pleasures. And within them, the single rose symbolized love, sex, and fleeting yet intense beauty. And we can see a very similar image on a sweatshirt produced by Alexander McQueen. It's called it's Patchwork Rose sweatshirt, incredibly similar imagery. And tragically, McQueen's referencing of the skull and the rose was to become also all too prescient when he tragically took his own life. Lots of McQueen's interpretations of the rose were dark and deathly, but many were joyful too. This extraordinary hat was designed for McQueen's Saraband collection by the London-based milliner Philip Tracy, with the most beautiful multicoloured silk roses. And I've been fascinated by hats for years. I've been fascinated by artificial roses for years, but I've never actually had an opportunity to work on a project where I could really foreground them. So the exhibition and book were the most wonderful opportunity to explore both. Most of my projects are usually started by a desire to interpret objects, garments, hats, a group of objects, or documents. So I tend to construct narratives in exhibition spaces or in books that orbit around surviving objects. This project was inspired by three very different sources. One was a quote that I read about 5 years ago by the modernist poet T.S. Eliot, and he wrote, "For the roses had the look of flowers that are used to being looked at." And I thought, what an amazing expression, I'll use that one day. The second reason was my mother has grown roses her whole life. Whenever you ask if she wants a present, she'd always rather have another rose than a garment than anything else. And also, I completely fell in love with Nick, the image maker, Nick Knight's sublime images, which he calls Roses from My Garden. He takes these images on his iPhone, he posts them on Instagram, and then he makes major artworks and makes them into huge scale, which he's exhibited at Albion Barn. This extraordinary image was posted on Instagram, and he always simply writes "Roses from My Garden." This was Sunday, the 10th of October, 2015. And he just captures the beauty and the fragility, the perfection, but also the degradation. He doesn't pull off the petals that are browning or marked. And I look at these and they just do something to my insides. And over the years, I've talked on Show Studio, I've reviewed the collections, but quite often Nick and I have talked about his love of roses. And so I was completely delighted when, for the book, he agreed to let me interview him on roses. And we have a very funny conversation where he tells me that the only tattoo he's got is of a rose. And I ask why. And he says, well, because Jock, who was the tattoo artist, couldn't draw a cat and he'd originally wanted a cat. And he talks about why the rose as opposed to any other flower. And I'd just like to quote something that he told me. He said, and I quote, "I like some of the things the roses evoked in me. They look like strokes from an artist's brush, a couture dress or feathers, and they have a poetic tragedy. They announce, here I am, I'm so beautiful, and I'm about to die. Enjoy my glory now, but I won't last long." And then he says roses are very much to do with death. So there's, in the same way, a bit like Alexander McQueen and lots of writers and artists and designers, there's the beauty, but there's also the very dark side of roses. When I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I was curator of 20th century dress, and I had the incredible privilege of having a bunch of keys, and I could go, the store was on site then, I could go and look in the stores when I had a chance, and just look at extraordinary objects. Since I left the V&A, I've consistently worked with museums and worked with their collections, but it wasn't until Valerie and Colleen agreed to work with me on my exhibition that I once again had the opportunity just to go into a collection and look at extraordinary, extraordinary objects. Most museum collections are classified by maybe a designer, by a period. They might be stored by the type of garment, you know, whether they're hung, they're laid flat. But collections are never classified by roses. So I kept coming to New York, and Colleen and I would walk down every single corridor and look in every single cupboard, because even lots of garments are described as flowery or floral printed, but it doesn't say it's a rose. And so it was the most extraordinary experience to be able to go and look at all these objects and identify which had roses. So showing you just a few of my favorites. This is the most beautiful day dress with voluminous gigot sleeves. It's made from a very fine cotton with a muted print of clusters of roses with rose leaves and rose buds in an unusual palette, actually, a sort of sepia tones and green. And it dates from about 1830 to 1833. It looks incredibly historical, but in light of recent trends for enormous sleeves, it also has a contemporary appeal. And as curators, or if we're writing a book and looking for images, I think we do also bear in mind what does have a contemporary appeal. This amazing shoe, it's by a designer called V. Busso. It dates from circa 1960. It's beautiful, it's elegant, it's bizarre, it's surreal in many ways, in terms of it's playing with displacement, about the improbability of a human being able to stand on a rose. It's just beautiful. I hope you can see that the heel is like a stalk with thorns. In fashion, it's very, very rare to see three-dimensional thorns. Quite often when we look at textiles, the textile print includes thorns, but thorns are very, very rarely included in 3 dimensions, not least because they could snag skin or fabric. So this is a rare depiction where we've got sharp metal thorns. And this is one of my favorite hats from the collection. It's by an American designer called Mr. John, dating from about 1950. Not only is it decorated with tiny artificial wild roses, it takes the form of a rose. It's like a head of a rose covered with sort of clusters of cotton rose petals. The other flowers are daisies, violets, and some unidentified yellow flowers. Mr. John called it Primavera, which means spring, and is obviously the title of one of Botticelli's most famous paintings. All the images I'm showing you of objects come from FIT's collection. They've been styled, photographed, conserved by the extraordinary team with whom I have the now pleasure of working with, and I'd like to thank them all for being so supportive, not least even before COVID, with me working the other side of the world. On the right is a dress by Charles James. I told you earlier he's one of my favourite designers. This dress is a dress that has followed me through my career. It's by Charles James, it's from 1937, and it's variously called La Sylphide or La Corselette. And it's obviously got this lovely bodice which is bedecked with artificial roses. When I was at the V&A, nearly all of our money went on buying, if we did have money to purchase, it went on purchasing historical dress, because on the whole we got given modern dress. But the one time I went to auction, I bought a model of this dress in canary yellow. And then in another project, I looked at 5 generations of dress at Brighton Museum, the Messel family dress collection. And Anne Messel was a society beauty, and she was friends with Charles James, and she had the dress in white, but it was completely perished. And then this dress I've looked at FIT for years, and it's a sort of key object in the exhibition. Now, whilst most museum collections privilege elite fashion that is directional, that is superlative in terms of quality, craftsmanship, it's directional, but it's not representative of what most people wear. And one of the theses that runs through the exhibition and through the book is the fact that, you know, very few of us ever get to wear a dress like this, which was worn by an American debutante called Miss Esme O'Brien in 1937. or maybe even indeed want to. Nearly all of us can look and feel transformed by holding or wearing one or more fresh roses. And I really wanted to show how the rose has this universal appeal. And so I started collecting portrait photographs on eBay, early portrait photographs from carte de visites to cabinet cards through postcards, and some portraits going up until about the 1920s. I bought this wonderful portrait on eBay. It came from America, of a woman who's chosen to be photographed in a studio, clearly wearing evening dress and a fur shrug. But in her lap, she's got a huge bunch of roses. And this is a spread from the book. From the introduction, I provide a sort of context. I look at the relationship between roses and fashion, and talk about the narrative of, everyone being able to look or feel transformed by wearing a rose. There's another cabinet card that I bought on eBay of a Japanese woman holding a rose. And I became really quite interested that the gesture of holding a rose in a studio photograph often echoed the pose that was used in portrait photography. It's a postcard photograph of two men. They both have a rose in their buttonhole, and one man is touching the rose in the other man's buttonhole. And at the bottom is a picture of a couple clearly on their wedding day, clearly not very well off. She's wearing a simple everyday dress, which is obviously not been bought especially for the occasion, but she's transformed. She's transformed by wearing a veil and the fact that she's holding roses. I also looked at how I've looked at roses in portraiture, and this is a portrait of Flora MacDonald by Alan Ramsay from 1749, and below it is a catwalk shot of Alexander McQueen's fall 2006 collection, which was called The Widows of Culloden, and in it he used lots of sheer tulle with black rose motifs, which made it look rather like a tattoo effect. As I said earlier, I've long been interested in hats, and I've long been interested in artificial flowers. But apart from writing Clara Button, I've not had an opportunity to work with them. I wrote Clara Button after I'd left the V&A. I'd always thought when I worked there how much fun it would be to write about being in the hat store, a child being in the hat store. And it took some years later, and the support of Mark Eastman, my publisher, who found Emily Sutton, who's the most extraordinary illustrator. And this is the real store in the V&A, where my character, Clara Button, deliberately gets lost. And so it says, Clara followed the trolley through a door into another room and found herself in a huge cupboard brimming with hats. Some looked like baskets, others like bunches of flowers, or presents tied up with a ribbon. One had a green bird perched on top of it with beady eyes that stared straight at Clara. Grown-ups used to wear some really strange hats, thought Clara. And if we look at these hats, all of which I know really quite well, on my right is, on the third shelf, on the second shelf up is a mauve hat covered in yellow roses. And then here are the hats from the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. Just some of very many which are going to be exhibited, some for the first time, in what I've called a rose garden of hats. On the left is a hat by Schiaparelli, and on the right, a hat from a label I've not heard before called Da Pinna. They're both from the 1950s. The Schiaparelli hat has a huge red artificial rose with green leaf, and it's got feathers which have been shaved down except to the tip, so that when the wearer wore this cocktail hat, they'd flutter. And the other hat I just was completely fascinated by, because rather than being formed of petals or taking the form of a rose, it's covered in rose leaves with a prominent red rose behind it. And this is a detail of artificial roses on a hat from 1908 in the museum's collection. Colleen and I found it. It's, as is characteristic at that time, it's a hat with a wide brim, a very wide crown and a broad brim. Hats were completely oversized at this point. And the crown of the hat is brimming with these absolutely beautiful, lush roses and rosebuds. But they were very damaged. And silk flowers are really fragile. Quite often they're made from quite cheap silk, and the silk shatters. They're bulky, they get damaged. And as a result, there aren't masses of hats that survive with really beautiful artificial roses. And it was amazing that the team at FIT conserved these. Interestingly as well, I'm fascinated by artificial flowers, but they're not collected in the same way that lots of other objects are. So for instance, we get, it's not only clothes and shoes and hats, there's buttons, fans, all sorts of things that are rose decorated, belts, what you call in America suspenders. This is a porcelain button from the mid to late 19th century, which is hand painted with a design of roses. Now, buttons are avidly collected. They're small, they're portable, they can be incredibly valuable financially, depending on the material and maybe the artist who's painted them. They can also be very cheap, so they're an incredibly accessible object to collect. They're also small, they're portable, they're easy to store. Many of the things that artificial flowers aren't. Artificial flowers, roses are bulky, they're fragile, they don't have a great deal of monetary worth. In the book, I've written a whole chapter called Permanent Botanicals, which is the name that artificial flowers were first given. They date back to ancient Egypt. So even that far back, when natural flowers were no longer available, their absence was missed so keenly that they were made from various materials in ancient Egypt, in China, in Rome, in Greece, made from bone, carved from precious metals. And this chapter looks at how the artificial rose was made. It compares the industries in I'll go back to this one. In Paris, New York, and London. In Paris, making artificial roses was an absolute craft. It was a trade that required a lengthy apprenticeship. The demand for roses was so great that they were bought year round, in a way that many artificial flowers only had a summer season, and people tended to order feathers in the winter. So for many people, it was a seasonal trade, which had huge ramifications on their income and livelihoods. So in Paris, it's regarded as a craft. It's an elevated status craft for women. Huge numbers of women are employed making flowers. And the rose makers are the queen of flower makers. They're the most highly paid. They have the most prestige because their job is the most skilled. And one academic called Marilyn Boxer even did research which proved that they married better, and saying better in inverted commas, which meant that they were more likely than the makers of violets or forget-me-nots to marry a non-manual worker. This is a photograph of Charles Lubin, which was an artificial flower maker from New York, and they kindly let us use this photograph of a workshop. Interestingly, in artificial flower making, although it's not shown in this photograph, there tended to be a lot more women than men. But interestingly, it was women who did the skilled work, which in the 19th century was quite an unusual arrangement. And then, whilst making flowers was in many ways a genteel craft, it was often based working from nature. It was also a highly toxic craft. Lots of the dyes were made with arsenic. Flower sellers died. They were poisoned. Flower makers working in New York and London really suffered, because whereas in Paris it was a sort of elite craft, in London and New York it was essentially a mass production industry with a huge division of labour, or very intensive sweated labour, working one person, one flower, or one family, one flower. In workshops, people were poisoned by fumes. They got really bad eyesight because the lighting was so poor. And this is a satirical cartoon which was illustrated in Punch, the London Journal, on February the 8th, 1862, and it's called The Arsenic Waltz. So it's making a comment on the fact that the flowers were dyed using these really toxic dyes. So as part of my research, I went to Maison Legeron in Paris and saw how they make flowers for the top fashion houses today, they also work with fresh roses. Maison Legeron is a firm that it's changed names over the years, but it was established in Paris in 1727, and it still works on the same site. So that was an amazing experience. I had a tour of that. And then I was really quite surprised to find close to my home in Sussex on the south coast of England, there's a working museum called Shirley Petal Company. And I went on a tour of this, and they showed me all the tools on. You can see all the iron tools, which you use to cut out petals and leaves. And then I was also interested to discover that they'd got perfume. So quite often artificial roses were perfumed. And here we can see Stafford Allen and Son had made perfume that smelled of violet, carnation, and rose. In an exhibition, it's not possible to use fragrance, which is a shame, because in an exhibition like mine, it would, the multi-sensorial element would obviously be very appealing, but you can't do it for conservation reasons, and you can't do it often for health and safety reasons with your audience. But writing a book is a different beast, and I was very pleased to invite my friend and colleague Mari Mackenzie to write a chapter on scent for the book. I also invited Jonathan Fyers to write a chapter about the cultural context of the rose. So he writes about how the rose has been used in art, in film, in politics. For instance, in recent years, the rose has been used, it's been used for all sorts of campaigns, including anti-female genital mutilation. So we span a huge spectrum from sort of Elizabethan dress to the anti-FGM campaign. Colleen Hill, my colleague who's here this evening, with whom I'm working closely, wrote a wonderful chapter about 18th century, looking specifically at textiles, because obviously it's the textiles rather than the silhouette at this point that is inspired by roses. And this is a detail of a menswear coat from the 18th century with a beautiful hand-embroidered design of roses. Obviously, this is elite menswear, very, very, the most wealthy men. But it's significant that in the 18th century and before, flowers weren't gendered feminine. They weren't really gendered feminine until the 19th century. So before then, in the 18th century, men wore flower-decorated apparel. And even going back to ancient Rome, which was absolutely obsessed with the rose, they used to have an annual festival called Rosalia, where they celebrated the rose. In ancient Rome, it was men who were awarded garlands of roses for what were regarded as great acts. And interestingly, it was also men who wore scent made from roses, because at the time women preferred much stronger smells. This wonderful garment, I've only discovered quite recently. I mean, Colleen obviously knew it was there. 18th century textiles they were valuable at the time because they were hand woven, hand embroidered, hand painted, and they've remained valuable ever since. Over the years, they were remade to adjust to different silhouettes in fashion. They were also repurposed to make fancy dress. But extraordinarily, this 18th century textile was remade in the silhouette of Christian Dior's 1947 New Look. So beautiful sculptural women's wear garment that's in the collection, and it's not in the book, but it will be in the exhibition. Jewellery is a vital part of the fashionable look, but precious jewels are very rarely exhibited in fashion exhibitions. They require different casing, different insurance. It's a very different beast. Quite often fashion exhibitions are on open display. You simply can't display priceless jewels. So whilst the rest of the book looks at fashion that is decorated or takes the form of a rose, this chapter puts dress on the back step, because the fact is that an awful lot of dress is and was designed to be completely plain. Often for women it was designed with a low neckline, expressly to display precious jewels. And my friend Geoffrey Munn, who is a world famous jewellery expert and is the presenter on one of the presenters on the Antiques Roadshow, which is a sort of cult British programme, wrote a chapter called The Unfading Flower of Jewellery. And amongst the jewels he shows is this extraordinary Russian wreath and earrings. They're made from priceless coloured diamonds in the shape of roses, with bees bumbling around the flowers and green enamel leaves. Dating from the 1730s, it's Russian. And in the book, I was quite interested to explore menswear. There's not a lot of menswear in most museum collections, and there's certainly not a lot of rose decorated menswear, apart from 18th century and some contemporary items. So I did quite a lot of research into the 19th century to see if men did wear roses. We all know they wore boutonnière, or a favour, a fresh rose in their buttonhole. But it became apparent that I knew everyone knows about waistcoats, that men would wear quite sober clothes, but they would wear a flamboyant flower patterned waistcoat perhaps. But then I discovered items that I certainly wasn't familiar with, such as hand embroidered suspenders, which in the UK we call braces. And then my colleague, Dr. Philip Sykas, who's a textiles expert, drew my attention to textiles that had been registered at the Public Record Office, including this one, which is a printed cotton, which was registered in London in 1879 and was used to make men's handkerchiefs. And it's like a foreign motif of a rose. It's a rose compiled of multiple roses. I also looked at the fresh flower industry, cultivating, selling and wearing fresh roses. And later on, likened the fast flower industry today to the fast fashion industry because they share many of the same evils. As a curator, we obsess on objects, we examine them, we look at them. I spent hours at FIT examining the hats, examining the artificial flowers, measuring them, noting how many buds there were, noting if the top of a leaf might be velour, but with a velvety texture, the bottom might not. And so I thought it was appropriate that I also examine roses. So one summer I went to my mother's garden and started just really studying the anatomy of the rose. And I was really quite interested to then discover that quite a lot of the terminology that describes the rose also has references with dress. So I'm going to look this up. I just have to look at my notes. And so, oh, I can't find it. But anyway, the sepals are the 5 green forms that support the flower. And they come from, I think it's a Greek word which means husk or envelope, which we could liken to dress. And other elements of the rose are the carpels, which are the pollen pieces that hold the pollen, are named after a term which is in Latin for warp, as in warp and weft, for weaving. So the more, I mean, you're looking for analogies, but it is fascinating that the more you look, the more you find. And then I started looking at how fresh flowers were worn. On the left is a cabinet card of Oscar Wilde. Now, Oscar Wilde was, as we all know, openly gay at a time that in England anyway it was illegal to be homosexual. And he was cruelly satirised in the press, often likened to, and I'm using inverted commas, unnatural flowers. So quite often sort of oversized, impossibly coloured flowers, which were obviously seen as an analogy to what was considered an unnatural sexuality. So I was very interested to find this carte de visite. This one I didn't buy, alas, this is in a collection. But seeing that Oscar Wilde actually chose to wear a buttonhole of a rose when he chose to be photographed. And he's photographed in 1885, and on the right is a cabinet card that I bought on eBay from America, dated 1884, of a woman, and on the reverse of the photograph, which is from Philadelphia, it says that it's a woman called Aileen B.E. Roussel, and it's dated December 1885. And she's wearing what I think is a fresh flower ornament as a corsage on the bodice of her dress. I think it's a fresh flower, not least because at the time when corsage were made by florists, they often combined roses with ferns. And it became very interesting as well looking at these photographs, because when you're looking at garments in the collection and hats, you look at them as objects, but you don't see how they interface with the body. Whereas when we're looking at the portraits, we can find different things. And one of them is the relationship of the flower, the scale, the way it interfaces with the fashionable body. I looked at how roses, just look at the time, roses form parts of rites of passage, certainly from ancient Rome up until the present day. I mentioned earlier about debutantes. The rosebud has often been used as a metaphor for female virginity, the full-blown flower for sexual consummation. Roses are popular, the flower of love in weddings. Less well known perhaps is the fact that they're also used to mark death. This is the chapter I wrote about the 19th century. At the top left is a vulcanite bangle, which would have been worn by a woman in mourning, not in the first stage when they didn't wear jewellery. It's a black bangle with a raised design of a rose on a stem with leaves. Beneath it is a lace with a motif of roses. And what I found really fascinating and seems morbid to us, but wasn't considered morbid at all at the time, is post-mortem photography. And this is a post-mortem photograph of a woman who's dead, taken in America in about 1844. It's a hand-tinted direct daguerreotype. And I've written on the caption, far from being considered macabre, photographs of the deceased at this time were considered to comprise vivid remembrances. This deceased young woman was clothed in a dress with a rose decoration, which the photographer hand-tinted pink. And it was quite often in studio portrait photography that the photographer would hand-tint a rose, which would draw your eye to it further. Now, as I've mentioned, an awful lot of rose symbolism was sort of sweetly romantic in the 19th century. It was aimed at predominantly white, middle and upper class women, heteronormative women, but there were, as ever, exceptions. And one of those exceptions is Walter Crane, who did these extraordinary illustrations for a book called Flora's Feast, which was published in 1889. On the left, we have a fairly typical sort of courtly romance type image of a woman with a huge hat in the form of a flower surrounded by a rose bush. But on the right, we have really quite surprisingly for 1889, we have burly rose lovers. They're dressed as wild roses, the distinctive five-petaled rose. They're wearing bodices with thorn decoration, skirts that look like petals. I don't know if the mules are red, whether they're meant to be rose hips or rose thorns, and they're surrounded by a briar of roses. Now, what was considered completely radical and shocking and outlandish in 1889 is perhaps less so today. I think many of the people present this evening will be familiar with all sorts of designers who design rose-themed fashions for women. Valentino, Gucci, Simone Rocha, many international designers. Perhaps a little less well known, which is why I'm showing you these, are designs that are designed either for men or for the new gender neutral market. On the left is a photograph from a Lagos-based company called Orange Culture. And it was from a collection called The Feeling from 2015. And I spoke to the designer, Oki Lowell, and he said that whilst he doesn't incorporate roses into the design of his clothing, he photographed this collection with, he's called them crowns of fresh roses. And he said that they were there to, they were called crowns of vulnerability. And it was about encouraging men to become more in touch with their emotional side. On the right is the London-based designer Ashish from his Bollywood Bloodbath collection. His clothes are very much inspired by sportswear styles, very ornately decorated, often using Indian embroidery techniques. And he's holding the classic sort of like Valentine rose that street vendors walk around with. And then on the left is a gender neutral designer who's based in New York called Nil, who my PhD student, Anthony Stikos, who's working on gender neutral fashion, told me about. And I mentioned it to Valerie and Colleen at FIT, and they said, oh, yes, we're familiar with his work. And so I'm hoping we're going to acquire this outfit for the exhibition. The designer is Neil Grotzinger, and I spoke to him, and he told me that he likes playing with extremes of what are considered conventional binary gendered materials, designs, motifs. So here he's taken 5 different types of lace with rose motifs. He's turned them into a sportswear style and used spray paint on them. And on the right is Prabal Parang, who again uses sportswear styles, here with a tie-dyed top and a sort of pop art print on what looked like tracksuit pants and rose decorated bag. The book started with a quote and it ends with a quote. The quote was written by George Eliot, female author, in 1868. It will never rain roses. When we want to have more roses, we must plant more trees. I thought it struck a very poignant note today. And I would just like to finish by saying that I'm delighted with the design of the book. It was designed by Charlie Smith. And these are some of the books excuse me, that she's worked on over the years, including Worth, which I wrote with Valerie Mendes, and Exhibiting Fashion, which I wrote with my friend and colleague Judith Clark, Judith Clark's handbag book. And she's worked with Judith on lots of projects, also the Vulgar, which you can see here. So I would like to say thank you to the publishers, thank you to Charlie Smith, thank you to FIT. It's a joy to work with you. And thank you for coming to my talk and hosting this event. And it's now my pleasure to take any questions.
So Amy, thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible. We've so enjoyed it. And I ask our audience to write any questions you have in the chat box. I did see a few pop up already, which I'm going to field for you. And Mesa wrote, what was the most difficult part in writing this book for you, and advice you would give to others embarking on it?
The most difficult part was the deadline. It was a wonderful project. I didn't have long. I wanted to do a book. I wanted to do a wonderful book. I had about maybe 16, 17 months on top of a full-time job. The time was the difficult bit. But also saying that I did it all the time. And I'm not a workaholic, but this was a labor of love. To be honest, at no point did I ever wish I was doing anything else other than writing this book. Although my family might not be quite so gracious about it. The time was difficult. The advice I would give is, if you're going to invite other people to contribute to a book, I know I mentioned my friends, but you tend to become friends with people whose work you admire and then you like. If you're editing a book, even if someone's amazing and they don't meet deadlines, do not work with them, because it's just so awful. Some writers won't even part with their work. They've written it and then they won't hand it over. Some miss the deadline endlessly. And the bottom line was, if this book didn't go to print, it wasn't going to come out on the 10th of September, which was when our exhibition was due to open, and there was no way I was going to miss the deadline. So my advice is, choose carefully your contributors. And I've got a long-term working relationship with Mark Eastman and Angeli Bully. So although the project was, and Charlie Smith, it happened at speed, but the fact that there's a sort of the ease of knowing each other, working with each other, knowing that you will meet the deadlines. And obviously I was hugely dependent on working with Colleen and the team at FIT, who took those beautiful photographs and conserved the objects. It's a happy project. It's a happy project on a beautiful subject.
Lovely. That's wonderful advice also. I'm wondering, Amy, if you could talk a little bit about what you feel the modern connotations of the rose are for you.
what I think has been really interesting is that more than ever before in the 21st century, the rose has been harnessed by an unprecedentedly politicized fashion industry. So the rose has always been used as a sort of romantic symbol, but from Alexander McQueen towards the end of the 20th century, but in the 21st century, what's fascinated me is that it's been harnessed to make a point about so many facets of contemporary society, about sort of, race, gendered identity, about female mutilation. So it's how the rose has been politicized, I think, that's particularly interested me. I've been, it was very sad to see how what was once a flourishing artificial flower industry around the world that employed, in Paris, it was one of the major employers of female workers in the late 19th century, and how the number dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. And I think what's been sad is that now there are just a few specialist workshops around the world that specialize, Maison Leisure on being one of them. And the demand for artificial flowers fell really in the 1960s when fashion became more informal, and the vogue for hat wearing every day changed, but also garments became more skimpy. There was less places to put flowers. So I think the sadness of seeing it's not lost, but it's the industry that was once flourishing and is no longer. But saying that, it still is a very important part of fashion. And there's a hat that we've acquired for the exhibition by Stephen Jones, and I was interested to know that in their atelier they actually make roses, whereas an awful lot of people still, do go to companies like Leisure to make their roses.
Amy, what was the most surprising piece of research that you discovered along this journey?
Well, I was pretty surprised about the postmortem photography in roses. I'm trying to think. Maybe the sheer number, and I wish I could remember numbers, but I can't. I think maybe the sheer number of women who were artificial flower makers in the 19th century. Tens and tens and tens of thousands in London, New York, and Paris. I knew it was a sweated trade, and I knew the bad side of it. I can't think of anything off the top of my head that was truly surprising.
Yeah, those are great answers. Thank you. Jacqueline wrote in and asked if you might speak a little bit about the obsession for women specifically with the rose and the color red.
Well, there's a big symbolism of color generally, but there is especially associated with roses. So, as I said before, the rosebud is often associated with virginity. It's also been likened to the human body a lot, often to the female body. And the colours are symbolic too. So historically, white roses have been associated with purity and innocence, red roses with passion. But also there's the association of red with blood. And in lots of ancient myths, it was quite interesting that quite often what became red roses started out white, and they became red either often by drops of blood, and so it's often entwined with stories about religion as well. So either tears or blood falling on a white rose was often said in mythology to turn a white rose red. And the gallery in the exhibition, there's one gallery which is the Rose Garden of Hats, and then there's a Garden of Fashion, and that is arranged by colour. So there will be sections on colour. And I'm always very struck by William Blake's poem, The Sick Rose, where he talks about crimson joy, sort of like unharnessed, unbridled sexuality and passion. And even today, wearing a bright red dress or a bright red rose does to some extent make a statement.
Amy, obviously the rose resonated with you deeply, or we wouldn't have this book in exhibition. But I'm curious, is there another flower out there that you feel has enough connotations through history and society to warrant a similar exploration?
Oh yes, most definitely. I've obsessed on violets in the past. and worked with colleagues, Alison Maloney, on a series of films that are available on Show Studio. And I did a film called The Violet Hour. And then working on another project with Judith Clark, I obsessed on daisies. Now, it makes it sound like flowers are at the foreground of my work, and they're absolutely not. But yes, there are all sorts of narratives that, tulips have got a whole other history. But if I was going to go on another flowery journey, it would most certainly be the violet.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Bria writes in and asks, was the rose ever queered in fashion history, or would you say there is more of a heteronormative use of the rose in fashion?
Well, I think in society until quite recent years, fashion was very binary gendered. The collection, now we're seeing the collections, they're less binary gendered. In the past, they were always male and female. Now they're not even male, female, they're more fluid. So it's they're shown together and it's gender neutral as well. I did want to explore non-heteronormative sexuality in roses, and went back and looked at poetry by Sappho. But I didn't find much. I asked friends who've researched LGBTQ history, and that is their specialist subject, if they could find me references with roses. And one of my friends did find me a very beautiful poem, which is a trans love poem in the book. Which I can't remember the name of the writer. Trace Peterson. And it was a poem called Exclusively on Venus. And it's a trans woman's love poem to a cis woman. And one of the lines is, roses are born this way, violets have a lesbian streak. Roses are trochaic, violets have their original plumbing. So I did try, and I suppose with all my projects, I wanted it to be inclusive and engage with diversity as well. But could I find a lot of historical examples? No. Walter Crane, I was delighted when I found that. J.J. Grandville did very wonderful illustrations in the 19th century in fleur animée, where his flowers, rather than being sort of passive and loving, they take revenge on human beings for cutting them with a florist's knife and letting them wilt on their breasts. And he makes these wonderful drawings of quite militant flowers. But no, I didn't find a great deal. But as I say, I did as much research as was humanly possible in the time. But yes, if I'd had 4 years to write a book, which I think probably would be more normal on top of a full-time job, I hope I would have found more.
What advice would you give to others interested in going into a curatorial field?
Well, I'd say come and do our fashion curation MA at London College of Fashion. And we've got PhD students. I think it's, when I started becoming a dress curator, it wasn't a fashionable occupation, but the competition was still really, really steep. Now being a fashion curator is a fashionable occupation. And I'm not saying obviously the person who's asked the question wants to do it for that reason, but it means there's more people that want to enter the field, but there are more opportunities. So for instance, when I trained, I could have worked in a museum or taught. And now all sorts of, there are other opportunities. There's very good auction houses. Timothy Long, the amazing fashion curator, is now working in America with an auction house. Lots of designers have got archives. They employ people to archive their collections. There's lots of online work. I think the advice is stick at it. It takes time. Don't give up. I think we've all done our stint of working in shops and waitressing and just sticking at it. I think nobody could have been more scared of public talking than I was, and my first job was teaching, and I just simply had to make myself do it. So I would say just stick at it. Go and look at lots and lots of exhibitions. But now I also think you do have opportunities, because I would say make the most wonderful Instagram. Sorry, my phone's dinging. Make the most wonderful Instagram. Do what you can do to put your work in the public domain.
Wonderful, wonderful. Amy, this has been such a treat. And on behalf of the National Arts Club and this great audience with their fabulous questions, I just want uh, to mention a quote you gave earlier. And you said, as a curator, we obsess on objects. And I, on behalf of this group and the club, want to thank you for that, because we wouldn't have this incredible book without your obsession over objects. So we thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your fabulous research with us and your great book. I just want to mention to those watching that this has been a production of the National Arts Club. And if you're not familiar with the club, you can check us out on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And on our YouTube channel, you'll find more great programs like this one. Amy De La Haye, thank you for joining us today. I'm
Thank
David.
you so much for having me.
Thank you.